Depending on where you were from, the 1970s were either a challenging time or a prosperous time for your automotive industry. Hello friends, my name's Emile and welcome back to some more Forza Top Gear laps, and today we're going to be taking a look at some iconic cars from the 1970s. We start today with the first ever Nissan Skyline GTR, the 2000 GT-R, 160 horsepower, 2,425 pounds of weight. Love them or hate them, you can't deny the GTR has certainly caught the world by storm, and well, it's fascinating to see what the first ever GTR Skyline looked like. It looks nothing like the more modern ones do. Anyways, the Skyline to drive, how does it drive? Well, it's pretty darn great to drive actually. I did really like driving this vehicle. It was a very nice little car to throw around. Obviously power wise it hasn't got too much. 160 horsepower isn't a lot, you know, but 2,425 pounds is relatively light for this sort of vehicle. Of course, as far as sports cars of the day goes, it might be a bit more on the heavier side than most of them. However, of course, it does have the advantage when it comes to its power. It is actually, surprisingly enough, because it has a little bit more power than most other sports cars, this is probably one of the more quicker vehicles in a straight line here today. And when the car has 160 horsepower, that's not really saying much. Of course, for today's episode, there isn't too many big, fast, powerful cars. In fact, the most powerful car today has 201 horsepower. That's it. Forza has a decent amount of 70s cars, however they're all from the same sort of class, so you're going to see sort of many cars from this sort of sports compact class. However, that isn't a bad thing because some of these cars are pretty darn interesting, such as the Mazda RX3 Savannah, 110 horsepower, 2,060 pounds of weight. This is the least powerful vehicle here today with just 110 horsepower. So, the RX3, what can we say about this car? Well, as far as I'm aware, this is the first ever production rotary engined vehicle, which obviously means it makes a very, very nice noise, reminiscent of a 787B. It is a bit more of a lower tone because it doesn't rev quite as far up the rev range. However, it is still a pretty darn interesting vehicle to hear. Anyways, how does the RX3 drive? Well, it's okay. It isn't brilliant. First of all, it is pretty gosh darn slow. In fact, you know, we had the Mini Cooper S go around here. Honestly, I think in a straight line speed contest between this and the Cooper S, the Cooper S might actually have the advantage in some regards, i.e. acceleration. It is a little bit quicker. And as far as the cars here today goes, this is by far and away the slowest in a straight line. Another issue I was having with the RX3 is related to its differential. It has an open diff, you can really feel that. It will try spinning up just one tyre over spinning up both most of the time, which isn't particularly advantageous. That does mean through the corners you should have to come off and on steering in order to make sure the car doesn't spin its back wheel. However, because this is the rain and the wheels can't actually get quite as much traction, diff issues aren't as big an issue as they would have been on the dry track. However, they can still cause issues, and they unfortunately did for the RX3. Next up we have a Renault Alpine A110, 123 horsepower, just 1,576 pounds of weight. This is by far and away the least powerful the least weighty vehicle here today, the lightest car here today I should say. Yeah, that is not a lot of weight. That's sort of getting on Donkavort levels of weight there. The Alpine is semi-decent is how I've sort of written it down here. What I mean by that is it's actually a decent enough vehicle to drive, however it does have one slight Achilles heel, and that is understeer. I assume it's because the fact that all the weight's over on the rear, and it's a little bit sort of wobbly through the corners, because of course this was a rally car. It does mean that it can generate a fair amount of understeer through the corners, and that does mean you do have to slow it down a bit. Nevertheless though, the Alpine was a surprisingly quick car around here. You know, it's only got 123 horsepower, but again, it only weighs 1,576 pounds. As far as straight line goes, I'm not quite sure if this is quicker than the GTR. I'd hazard a guess and say no. However, through the corners, Despite the understeer, you can actually take a fair amount of speed through the corners because it doesn't really slide all that much. Despite being rear-engine rear drive, it doesn't want to kick its tail out too much, which is quite nice. Usually with sort of rear-engine rear-wheel drive cars, you'd expect snap oversteer. But the Alpine simply does not have it. I guess that's due to it not having too much in the way of power. However, I enjoyed my time with the Alpine, I really did. Good car. Next up we have a Lancia Stratos, 190 horsepower, 2,161 pounds of weight. Now, we had the Stratos go around in its own special little episode in the last season of the Top Gear laps, and it performed relatively well. I mean, again, this is a lower class car, but it didn't do too badly. Most of what I said handling wise can be carried onto the wet track. It is pretty darn wallowy through the corners. This thing really just dives and leans and does all of that through the corners because of course it has sort of more rally orientated suspension, similar to the Alpine. However, the Stratos is much worse for it. However, it is also a little bit on the slidey side, which can be a bit problematic. I mean, again, I guess the rain does enhance that a little bit, but it is a slightly more slidey vehicle. However, once we hit the straight lines, this is by far and away the fastest car in a straight line here today. It is damn quick in the straight line. Of course, it's got the aerodynamic advantage, as you'd expect, because it's basically shaped like a block of cheese. You know, power's pretty decent, 190 horsepower, second most powerful car here today. As far as power to weight ratios go, it's probably one of the better vehicles here today as well. So, yeah, the Stratos can do well, as you can see me get a huge slide through there. Not my favourite car to drive, however, it certainly isn't ridiculously bad. Next up, we have a Ford Escort RS 1800, 115 horsepower, 1,986 pounds of weight. So, 115 horsepower, it has 5 more horsepower than the RX3 did. However, it does weigh a little bit less than the RX3 did. So, it's basically an RX3, but better. How does it drive? Well, it drives like the RX3 does. Yeah, these vehicles are pretty darn similar in the way they drive. Ultimately, the Escort's probably the better of the two. It has slightly less in the way of open differential issues. It's a little less sort of slidey through the corners. It is a tiniest bit quicker. Not by much, but it is quicker than the RX3. Of course, you do miss out on that fantastic rotary engine note, which, to be honest with you, would probably be enough to sway me on the RX3. However, as a huge Ford Escort fan, I still would probably go with the Escort. It is a good car, the Escort, actually. Probably not the best car to drive stock, however, if you used to throw some upgrades onto this thing, you know, I'm sure this could make an absolutely fantastic D-Class, C-Class car. You know, stick some aero on it, stick some more power in it, race suspension, race brakes, upgraded tyres, this thing would be pretty darn good. As it stands stock, it isn't particularly great, however, it isn't a bad car. You know, it's the same with the RX3, it isn't a bad car per se, it's just a little bit disappointing, and ultimately not one of the better cars here today. Anyways, we move on to the Pontiac Firebird from 1977, 201 horsepower, 3,800 pounds of weight. This is by far and away the heaviest vehicle here today. In fact, it almost weighs double what the some of the lighter cars here today do. So yeah, it is a pretty darn heavy beast, this one. However, the Firebird is the most powerful car here today, 201 horsepower. When I say that's the most powerful car here today, that usually means we've got a few issues. However, yeah, 201 horsepower isn't really a lot by modern standards. However, back in the day, this car was probably one of the quickest sort of, I guess you'd call this a muscle car of the day. I mean, it's 1977, so yeah, I mean, what, the Corvette was throwing out 200 horsepower, 180 horsepower in California at this point, so yeah, the Firebird was a bit quick. Anyways, how does the Firebird drive? Well, it's very nice to drive, actually. Probably one of the more nicer vehicles here today to drive. I mean, the Skyline's pretty good as well. The next car coming up is also absolutely fantastic to drive as well. But the Firebird is pretty decent. You can certainly feel that weight when you're behind the wheel though. This is a heavy, heavy beast. It really does feel like to make this effective you'd probably need to throw most of the weight out of this vehicle. But once you've done that though, I can imagine it would be a pretty decent vehicle to drive, because again, it drives pretty solidly, especially for a car that weighs £3,800. Anyways, finally today we have the Opel Cadet C GT-E, 114 horsepower, 2,028 pounds of weight. So, again, this is similar to the RX3, which is similar to the Escort, which is similar to this. As far as between this and the Escort, there isn't really much to tell. It has one less horsepower than the Escort. It has a little bit more weight than the Escort. It's a little bit lighter than the RX3. It has 4 more horsepower than the RX3. So again, these vehicles are extremely similar. However, unlike the Escort and the RX3, how does the Cadet drive? It is pretty damn nice, actually. I really liked my time with the Cadet. Now, obviously, as you know, I'm not a huge Opel Vauxhall fan. I don't like them particularly much. However, I will say the Cadet is a pretty fun little car to throw around. I also really like the two-tone paint job on it. Ultimately, though, as great as it is to drive, it can't detract from the fact that this thing is slow. It is very slow, this car. 114 horsepower isn't a lot in a game because it weighs slightly more than the Escort. It's a little bit slower in a straight line than the Escort. It's probably a teeny bit quicker than the RX3 in a straight line, although again, honestly, not by much. This thing wouldn't really be that much quicker than the Mini Cooper S in a straight line. However, yeah, I did enjoy my time with the Cadet, and once again, this is another one of those cars which, seriously, if you was to throw some upgrades on, I can see this being a pretty darn good D-Class, C-Class car for you to throw yourself around in. Pretty good car. As it stands stock, not the most powerful car, not the most competitive, however, it's definitely one of the more fun ones. Anyways, on to the times, and the Stratos was the fastest car of the day, going into 10th with a 132.594. This is followed by the Alpine A110, 136.958, puts into 14th place. That's pretty good for the Alpine. I was not expecting it to be that quick. Of course, with the Stratos, I was kind of expecting that. Kind of surprising it didn't really beat the R32 Golf. However, again, decent times from both of those vehicles. Moving down the board, the Skyline GTR goes into 16th with a 137.818. Slightly beats out the Datsun 240Z we had last week. Firebird goes into 18th with a 139.611. Escort goes into 19th with a 130.709. Cadet is just a second off that. Again, I assume it's because it's slightly slower in a straight line. The RX3, unsurprisingly, is kind of towards the bottom of the board. It only marginally beats the Cooper S by 0.6 for the second. Yeah, the RX3 just isn't a particularly quick car, isn't a particularly exciting car. Yeah, a bit of a shame that our first rotary car on the board has to fall to the bottom of the leaderboard. However, there is still plenty of rotary cars left in the game, so hopefully they can redeem themselves. Anyways, friends, that is it for this episode of the Forza Top Gear Laps. In the next episode, we're going to be taking a look at the iconic cars from the 1980s, so join me for that. And as always, if you have any suggestions for cars you'd like to see go around the track, feel free to suggest them in the comment section below. Anyways, friends, I want to thank you all very much for watching. My name's been the Real Emile. Until next time, farewell.